Hello, my name is Floyd Maxwell, justthinkit.com. This video is called Consequences of a Spring and Loop Theory, the Ether. As promised, here's the fourth in the Consequences series. After the title, I say, we need it, and Newton knew it. COASALT to date. Spring and loop theory provides a unique clarifying lens with which to study how the universe works at all scales. Regarding the speed of light, spring and loop theory has been predictive and revolutionary. With black holes, spring and loop theory has been able to provide additional explanations as to why light transmission is halted inside the event horizon. With Einstein's equation, spring and loop theory achieved parity with existing physics, failing at a direct derivation but containing modeling building blocks beyond what any other theory has to offer. When it comes to the ether, also referred to as the ether with an AE beginning, or the luminiferous ether, which basically means the light-carrying ether, spring and loop theory finds itself in an army of one situation, battling not just a few but the majority of physicists. So I find myself forced to take the critical path. Spring and loop theory believes that the doldrums modern physics finds itself in are directly caused by it turning its back on the ether. A well-known rule of law is that you can't prove a negative. The defendant, without an alibi, can never prove she didn't do it. Hence the innocent until proven guilty starting point. Modern physicists clearly disagree with this law. Having tried to detect the ether and come up empty, most physicists today say there isn't one. The difference between an atheist and an agnostic comes to mind. God said it, I believe it, and that's that. An agnostic is someone who neither believes nor disbelieves, whereas an atheist disbelieves. William L. Rowe. As agnostic as most physicists would claim to be, they are clearly atheistic when it comes to the ether. This is of no consequence, of course, unless there really is an ether. There is a fork, but no spoon. Modern physics is at once the most tolerant and intolerant of sciences. String theory, as ugly a theory as has ever been presented, is more than tolerated because, why? Well, because supporting it makes thousands of scientists a very good living. That's why. The concept of an ether that light travels through is not tolerated. Why? Because it hasn't been found yet. Einstein giveth and Einstein taketh away. Quote, the timeline of luminiferous ether begins in the 18th century with the concept of luminiferous ether, light-bearing ether, or ether as a medium for electromagnetic propagation. Wikipedia. The ether says, they love me. Quote, since the development of special relativity, theories using a substantial ether are not used anymore in modern physics and are replaced by more abstract models. Wikipedia. The ether. They love me not. Quote, it is ironic that Einstein's most creative work, the general theory of relativity, should boil down to conceptualizing space as a medium when his original premise in special relativity was that no such medium existed. Robert B. Laughlin, Nobel laureate in physics, endowed chair in physics, Stanford University. Wikipedia. The ether. He loves me not? He loves me. Einstein says that special relativity does not require rejecting the ether, and that the gravitational field of general relativity may be called ether, to which no state of motion can be attributed. Wikipedia. The ether. He tolerates me. Behold, an ether bunny bearing gifts. For the past 400 years, scientists have speculated on light and ether. Henri Poincaré thought the ether might be unobservable, but he considered it a convenient hypothesis and continued to use the concept in later papers. Wikipedia. Spring and loop theory takes a similar approach, going one stage further by coming up with a more realistic theory of what the ether is, and promptly harvesting the fruits such an improved theory brings. Picking up speed on the road less traveled. From the beginning, spring and loop theory has maintained that the ether, in quotes, is pure energy and is in fact the highest energy there is, the spring-like energy of the universal matrix itself. After wrestling with the gravity propagation problem for months, spring loop theory heard mention in an Amazon comment that gravitons were loops, and soon put it all together, building on the universal matrix foundation by imagining how graviton loops could work well with the ether springs. Spring loop theory realized that the loop-spring interaction was what caused gravity, that the gravity effect was propagated through the ether, i.e. through the spring system. Unification of the four forces was the icing on an already pretty sweet cake. Today, consequences of a spring loop theory would add that the ether could never be a solid, liquid, or gas system, because these are all spring loop systems. All these years, scientists have been trying to find, measure, confirm a system that is neither a solid, a liquid, nor a gas, has constituents that are 10 to the 20 times smaller than a proton, and vibrates at the speed of light. No wonder it has remained so elusive. A long overdue aside. In May 2013, 5 months after publishing Spring and Loop Theory, I read Lee Schmolen's 3 Roads to Quantum Gravity. In it, Lee outlined 3 approaches: black hole thermodynamics, loop quantum gravity, and string theory to a quantum theory of gravity. Spring and loop theory had to take a 4th road. Where Schmolen had identified the shortcomings of string theory, spring and loop theory had avoided the mistake Schmolen had made. He imagined a universe of gravitons, and spring and loop theory imagined the inverse, a universe of energy. For what it is worth, Higgs seems to have made the same mistake as Schmolen, as have the field theory people. Oh well. You can lead a physicist to ether. Life can be difficult for the lead dog. Yes, the view is always new, but if the other dogs are not leashed behind you, they will wander off in all directions. Everyone doing their own thing was needed in the early days of the microchip, but today, companies are moving in lockstep toward a wonderful wireless world where companies monitor our every breath while we happily share our baby pictures in a hideous Windows 8 interface. Unhealthy levels of groupthink, but healthy design decisions. As complete and consistent as spring and loop theory is, it has limited value to life if the majority of physicists are following inferior theories. On the other hand, it will be pretty hard for others to steal the credit for spring and loop theory. The lost years. Oh, what might have been. Physics could have been completely different today. Several decades of mental growth have been lost, and far too many pointless, mine is bigger than yours, mega projects have been built and publicly financed. Did you know the LHC has an operating cost of $5 billion per year? This lunacy is the result of physicists continually taking the path of looking through larger and larger haystacks for smaller and smaller needles that have less and less value to science or life, and they get paid by thee and me to do this. Personally, I would say the value of the LHC is about minus $10 billion per year, minus $5 billion in money that could have been spent somewhere useful, and minus $5 billion for the damage of paving a yellow brick road to Wrongsville that future generations of budding physicists will follow with boxer-like blinkers. Ether jam. In the old days, when we used to pride ourselves on our ability to cut down trees, things like log jams were studied. A theory was advanced that log jams were held back by a key log. This concept was later used by self-development gurus to encourage people to discover what their key log was, so that they could liberate their log and their life. Spring and loop theory suggests we try the "there is an ether" key and unlock our theories accordingly. Click here to like the ether. For those needing a reason to drop their ether hate, consider this. The Michelson-Morley experiments, and I'm sure every other ether measuring experiment, all had the same flaw. They all assumed the ether would cause waves of light or otherwise to propagate faster or slower depending on how they were moving relative to the ether medium. I'm not aware of any ether test that considered the possibility of the ether itself moving at the speed of light, as spring and loop theory maintains it does. If they had, they would have recalled the Einstein thought experiment of riding on a beam of light and encountering photons coming toward the observer at light speed. So how could one measure a speed difference based on relative motion when Einstein's theory, or at least his thought experiment, says there cannot be one? It gets better. Interestingly, as I typed into Google, quote, Einstein riding a beam of light, quote, and clicked the first link, I ended up on a page authored by chemical engineer turned physicist John D. Norton, who proceeds to defend the ether. How serendipitous. There truly is more to the ether than meets the eye. In the time I spent today doing final research and writing, I have seen the number of interesting thoughts, links, and articles grow in an almost exponential fashion. I hope I have inspired you to want to read further as well. By the way, spring and loop theory says that the ether, i.e. springs, are such small components relative to matter, i.e. loops, that the motion of one has little if any impact on the motion of the other, at speeds much smaller than the speed of light anyway. Springs can pass right through atoms, like mosquitoes through a tennis racket. Try to measure that. Coming up, Einstein built on the earlier work of Poincaré, Lorentz, and Larmor, discarding exactly the ether component of their theory before relabeling it as solely his own theory. This was morally wrong, and also set physics back a generation or more. Consideration of why historians and reporters have given Einstein criticism-free status on this issue is beyond the scope of spring and loop theory. In the next talk, COASALT takes on a subject more respected but even more poorly understood than the ether. Considered the weakest force, it has proven again and again to be a giant killer. Einstein tried for 30 years to figure it out, but never did. Feynman, hoping to contribute something more than being an allegedly entertaining physics professor, produced nothing. Quote, "Gravity is not responsible for people falling in love, Albert Einstein." Yes, he might be wrong again.